The glossy brochure had promised transformation through isolation in bold letters across its front page, the words superimposed over a serene image of mist-covered mountains. I'd studied it for weeks, tracing my finger over photographs of previous participants, their faces glowing with what the caption called the clarity of true survival. A wilderness camp where we would strip away the comforts of modern life and discover our true selves, it claimed. 28 days in the remote mountains of northern Washington state. No phones, no internet, no contact with the outside world. Just 8 strangers and our expert wilderness guide, learning to become one with nature. I should have paid more attention to the fine print at the bottom. Anthropics LLC assumes no responsibility for physical or psychological changes experienced during the program. I should have noticed how the testimonials never included last names or contact information. I should have trusted that gnawing feeling in my stomach when I first stepped out of the transport van and saw the trailhead, a narrow opening in the dense forest marked by a weathered wooden sign with symbols carved into its edges that didn't look like any hiking markers I'd ever seen. The other participants seemed normal enough at first glance. There was Elaine, a corporate lawyer with perpetually perfect posture, who spoke of needing to reset her inner compass. Michael, a soft-spoken high school science teacher whose hands trembled slightly whenever he spoke. Rachel, recent divorcee with laugh lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled, though her smiles never quite reached those eyes. David, a tech consultant who couldn't seem to stop checking his empty wrist where his smartwatch usually sat. And others, Kaylee, Jason, and Thomas, all with their own stories and reasons for being there, all seeking something they couldn't find in their everyday lives. But our guide, Marcus, should have been my first real warning. Tall and lean, with skin tanned like old leather, he had eyes that never seemed to settle on anything for more than a second or two, always darting back to the treeline, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. His knuckles were scarred, white lines crisscrossing over sun-darkened skin. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent I couldn't quite place. Something old, something not quite from here. The journey to base camp will take approximately 6 hours, he announced after we'd all introduced ourselves, adjusting his heavy pack with practiced ease. We must reach the clearing before nightfall. Stay close. The forest can be disorienting. The way he paused before that last word made my skin prickle. We hiked in silence for the most part. The weight of my backpack dug into my shoulders, the straps chafing against my skin through my thin cotton shirt. But the pain felt good, purposeful, the first step toward shedding my dependence on comfort. The trail started wide but gradually narrowed as we ventured deeper into the wilderness. The forest grew denser with each mile, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in thin, green-tinted beams that barely reached the forest floor. The air smelled of pine and something else, something earthy and ancient. Mushrooms sprouted in clusters at the bases of trees, some varieties I recognized, others alien and strange with caps that seemed to pulse slightly if you looked at them too long. I noticed Marcus made wide detours around certain types, sometimes guiding us several yards off the path to avoid a particular cluster. I noticed, too, how he checked his compass frequently, sometimes stopping abruptly to stare at it, then at the surrounding trees, his brow furrowed in what looked increasingly like confusion rather than concentration. "Everything okay?" I asked during one such pause, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the hushed forest. He startled, as if he'd forgotten we were there. "Fine," he said too quickly, just confirming our route. But I glimpsed the compass face before he tucked it away. The needle was spinning erratically, not settling on any direction. By late afternoon, my legs were trembling with exertion, my lungs burning with each breath of the thin mountain air. The others looked equally exhausted, though no one complained. We'd all signed up for this, after all. Transformation doesn't come easy. The trees suddenly parted, and we reached our destination. It was an almost perfectly circular clearing, perhaps 200 feet in diameter, ringed by towering pines that seemed to lean inward slightly, as if bowing toward the center. The ground was covered in a carpet of lush grass that looked too vibrant, too green for this elevation and climate. At the center stood a cluster of basic wooden structures, 4 small cabins arranged in a square, with what looked like a common area and fire pit in the middle. "Welcome to base camp," Marcus said, but the enthusiasm in his voice sounded forced, rehearsed. I noticed none of the cabins had windows, just narrow slits cut into the wood at eye level. The doors were thick and heavy, with iron reinforcements that seemed excessive for a wilderness retreat. That first evening, as twilight descended, Marcus built a fire in the central pit. The flames caught quickly, too quickly, and burned with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the amount of kindling used. The fire cast long, dancing shadows across the clearing, making the surrounding forest wall appear to shift and move. We sat on rough-hewn logs arranged around the fire, eating a simple meal of dried meat and hard bread that Marcus distributed from his pack. No one spoke much. The day's hike had drained us, but it was more than physical fatigue that kept conversation minimal. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of expectation, as if the clearing itself was listening. And that was when I first noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest was. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves despite the occasional breeze, no distant calls of birds or animals, just the occasional crack of burning wood breaking the silence. "You want to memorize the rules," Marcus said abruptly, his face grim in the firelight, shadows deepening the hollows of his cheeks and eye sockets. "These are not suggestions. They are the difference between returning home and becoming part of this place." We all leaned forward slightly, suddenly alert despite our exhaustion. 1. Never wander alone. Always travel with at least one other person, preferably more. His voice had taken on a rhythmic quality, as if he'd recited these words many times before. 2. Be in your cabins by nightfall. Once the sun sets completely, do not step outside until dawn, no matter what you hear or see. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks spiraling upward. In the momentary flare of light, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree-line, a shadow slightly darker than the others, with an unnatural fluidity to its movement. 3. Marcus continued, his gaze now fixed on the flames. If you hear your name being called from the woods, ignore it, no matter how familiar the voice, no matter how urgent it sounds. Ignore it. Someone laughed nervously. Jason, I think. You're joking, right? This is just part of the experience, some psychological test. Marcus didn't smile. His eyes reflected the firelight in a way that made them appear to glow from within. 4. If you see lights in the forest at night, do not look directly at them. You may observe them peripherally, but direct eye contact will draw their attention. The nervous laughter died. Even the skeptics among us had fallen silent, perhaps sensing, as I did, that Marcus wasn't engaging in some team-building exercise or trying to create atmosphere. There was real fear behind his words. 5. Count yourselves every morning. Make sure everyone is accounted for. He paused, then added more quietly, and if someone is missing, do not call for them. What happens if someone is missing? Elaine asked, her lawyer's precision cutting through the tension. Marcus stood abruptly, throwing his face into shadow. Then we continue with those who remain. He assigned us to cabins, 2 cabins for the women, 2 for the men, for people in each, and instructed us to settle in for the night. As we dispersed, I heard him murmuring something under his breath that sounded like a prayer, or perhaps an incantation, in a language I didn't recognize. My cabin was sparse, just 4 bunk beds with thin mattresses, a small wood stove in the center, and hooks on the walls for our packs and clothing. The only light came from a battery-powered lantern Marcus had provided. No electricity, of course. No running water. Just 4 walls that suddenly seemed too thin, too permeable. I had chosen a bottom bunk, and as I lay there in the darkness, I could hear the breathing of my 3 cabin mates above and across from me. Rachel had the bunk above mine, and she kept whimpering in her sleep. Small sounds of distress that made me wonder what she was seeing behind her closed eyelids. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by strange dreams of roots growing up through the cabin floor and wrapping around my ankles. The air inside the cabin grew increasingly cold as the night deepened, despite the wood stove that we'd stoked before bed. My breath formed small clouds with each exhale. I must have finally fallen into a deeper sleep, because I was startled awake by a hand clamped firmly over my mouth. My eyes flew open, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. It was Marcus, his face inches from mine, eyes wide with urgency. "Quiet," he whispered, removing his hand slowly, finger raised to his lips. "Listen." At first, I heard nothing but the blood rushing in my ears. Then, faintly, someone calling my name from the darkness outside. My name, in a voice that sounded almost like my mother's, but with something wrong about it. Too hollow, too echoing, as if the sound was being produced by something that had only a theoretical understanding of human speech. "Mom," I whispered, an instinctive response that I immediately regretted. Marcus's grip on my arm tightened painfully. "Rule 3, he hissed, his voice barely audible. "Remember Rule 3. The voice continued calling, moving around the perimeter of the clearing, growing closer to our cabin, then fading, circling like a predator testing defenses. It called my name with increasing desperation, now pleading, now angry, now seductive. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voice seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly inside my skull. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrible as the calling had been. Marcus nodded once and left without another word, moving to the door with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. I noticed my cabin mates were all still asleep, or pretending to be. I wondered if each of them had received their own personalized visitation during the night, their own voices calling to them from the darkness. I didn't sleep again. I lay awake, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin settling. Just before dawn, I heard what sounded like soft scratching at the door, not like an animal trying to get in, but rather like someone delicately drawing their fingernails across the wood in a deliberate pattern. When morning finally came, announced by thin beams of light through the wall slits, I was already dressed and ready to leave the suffocating confines of the cabin. The clearing looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow, less perfectly circular. The grass, which had seemed so unnaturally green the previous evening, now appeared patchy and yellowed in places, forming irregular patterns that almost resembled symbols when viewed from certain angles. At breakfast, a tasteless porridge that Marcus prepared over the communal fire. No one mentioned the voices from the night before, though I could see the exhaustion etched on every face. Dark circles underlined bloodshot eyes. Hands trembled slightly around wooden bowls. Conversation was minimal, practical. We began our training that day, fire starting without matches, shelter building, identifying edible plants in the surrounding forest, though Marcus was very specific about which areas we could forage in. The practical tasks helped distract me from the growing unease I felt whenever I looked at the surrounding treeline. The physical exertion was a relief, allowing me to attribute my racing heart and cold sweats to exertion rather than fear. That night, I noticed Rachel writing in a small notebook before bed, her pen moving furiously across the page. "Keeping a diary?" I asked, try to sound casual, normal. She startled, snapping the book closed. "Just recording observations," she said, "for after." "After what?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "After we're transformed." On the third day, Rachel didn't show up for breakfast. "She probably just overslept," Michael suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We all remembered Rule 5. Marcus immediately ordered us to check the cabins. I returned to our shared space, calling Rachel's name as I pushed open the heavy door. Her bunk was empty, her sleeping bag neatly made as if she hadn't slept in it at all. Her backpack remained propped against the wall, but her shoes were gone. "She wouldn't have gone out alone," I said when we reconvened by the fire pit. She knew the rules. Marcus's face had gone ashen. He organized a search party, everyone moving in groups of 3, no one to separate under any circumstances. We combed the area around the camp, calling Rachel's name despite Rule 5. No response came, just that unnatural silence of the forest swallowing our voices. We found her shoe by a small stream about half a mile from camp. Just one shoe, a sturdy hiking boot, sitting upright as if she'd carefully placed it there. The ground around it showed no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. Just a single shoe beside running water that moved too sluggishly for its gradient, almost as if it were flowing through something more viscous than water. Thomas picked up the boot, turning it over in his hands. "There's nothing inside," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "No remains. Nothing." But he was wrong. As he tilted the boot, something fell out, a small, perfectly round stone, smooth and black as obsidian, with a single red line running through its center like a vein. Marcus snatched it from the ground before any of us could touch it, his movements almost violent in their suddenness. He hurled the stone into the stream without a word of explanation. It didn't splash when it hit the water. It sank silently, leaving no ripples. "Back to camp," he ordered. "Now." "But Rachel," Kaylee began. "Is gone," Marcus said flatly. "And we will be too if we don't return before dark." That night, Marcus doubled the watch shifts. I volunteered for the midnight rotation, knowing sleep would elude me anyway. As the hours crawled by, I sat on the rough-hewn bench outside the cabins, staring into the darkness beyond our clearing, clutching a sharpened stick that felt woefully inadequate against whatever might be out there. I was paired with David, the tech consultant whose withdrawal from digital connectivity had manifested as a nervous tic. He kept tapping his fingers against his thigh in patterns that resembled typing. We spoke little, both of us too consumed by our own thoughts, too aware of the vastness of the wilderness surrounding our tiny island of firelight. Around 2 a.m., I saw them, pinpricks of light drifting between distant trees. At first, I thought they were fireflies, but they moved with too much purpose, weaving through the forest in patterns that seemed almost mathematical. They pulsed with a bluish-white glow that seemed to bend the darkness around them rather than illuminate it. I remembered Rule 4 and averted my eyes, though the temptation to look directly at them was overwhelming. A pressure built behind my eyelids, an almost painful urge to turn and stare. My watch partner, David, wasn't so disciplined. From the corner of my eye, I could see him staring, transfixed, at the lights. His mouth hung slightly open, his pupils dilated so wide that his eyes appeared completely black in the dim firelight. "David," I hissed, keeping my gaze firmly on the ground. "Don't look at them." He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. I reached out and shook his shoulder, careful to maintain my own diverted gaze. "David." Nothing, no reaction. His skin felt strangely cool beneath my touch, not quite cold, but absent of the usual human warmth. It wasn't until the lights finally disappeared, fading like stars behind clouds, that he blinked and turned to me, confusion evident in his expression. "Did you say something?" he asked, his voice slightly slurred, as if he were waking from a deep sleep. "The lights," I said. "You were staring at them." He frowned. "Lights? What lights?" The next morning, David remembered nothing about the lights, and though I counted carefully, all 6 remaining participants were present at breakfast. Yet something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that David wasn't quite David anymore. He spoke differently, choosing his words with a deliberation that hadn't been present before. He moved differently too, his gestures too fluid, too graceful for someone who had spent most of his adult life hunched over a keyboard. When he thought no one was looking, I caught him staring at his own hands as if they were foreign objects, turning them over and flexing the fingers with an expression of detached curiosity. Once, I saw him pinch his own arm hard enough to leave a mark. His face registered no pain, only interest. At lunch, he collected everyone's leftover food, explaining that he was suddenly ravenous. But later, I found the food untouched, arranged in a perfect circle behind his cabin. By the end of the first week, 2 more participants had vanished, Kaylee and Jason. Both disappeared during the night, though they had been in separate cabins. Both left behind some small personal item arranged in a way that seemed deliberate. Kaylee's hair ribbon tied around a stone similar to the one we'd found in Rachel's boot. Jason's watch with the hands removed, the empty face staring up at the sky like a blind eye. Marcus's leadership began to falter. He spent more time alone, consulting a journal filled with writing that didn't look like any alphabet I recognized. The rules expanded. Don't go near the stream. Don't look up at the sky for too long. If you see a circle of mushrooms, walk around it, never through it. Don't collect the strange flowers that had begun to bloom around the clearing, perfect white blossoms with too many petals that opened only at night. I started keeping a journal of my own, documenting everything, the disappearances, the lights, the voices that called our names at night. I wrote about the clearing itself, how it seemed to change shape subtly when no one was looking directly at it. I sketched the strange symbols I found carved into tree trunks, symbols that Marcus refused to explain, but that I often caught him tracing with his fingertips, his lips moving in silent recitation. I documented how the remaining participants were changing. Elaine no longer stood with perfect posture. She now curled inward, defensive, jumping at shadows. Michael's hands had stopped trembling, but now moved with an unsettling precision, his fingers often forming shapes in the air that left briefly visible trails, like smoke patterns that lingered seconds too long. Thomas had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through nods and written notes and handwriting that grew increasingly abstract and symbolic. And David smiled too much now. His teeth seemed slightly sharper, his gums receding. He didn't blink enough, sometimes going for minutes without closing his eyes. At night, I often woke to find him sitting upright in his bunk, staring at the wall, murmuring conversations with someone or something that wasn't there. On the 10th night, I woke to find Marcus standing at the narrow slit window of our cabin, staring out into the darkness. The moonlight outlined his profile, and I noticed with a shock how much he had aged in just over a week. Deep lines etched his face, and his hair, which had been salt and pepper upon our arrival, now showed stark white at the temples. "What is it?" I whispered, careful not to wake Thomas and David in the other bunks. Thomas was a heavy sleeper now, but David, or whatever was wearing David's skin, seemed to register everything. "We need to leave," Marcus said without turning around, his voice barely audible. This was a mistake. We should never have come back here. Back, I slipped out of my sleeping bag and joined him at the window, the floorboards cold beneath my bare feet. "You've been here before?" In the faint moonlight, I could see his face had aged years in just days. His eyes held a resigned despair that made my blood run cold. "Every 5 years, they need to be fed," he murmured, more to himself than to me. That was the agreement. That was the price for my transgression. I thought I could control it this time. Set the terms. "What are you talking about? Who needs to be fed?" He finally looked at me, his eyes hollow with a depth of despair I couldn't fathom. "The clearing. This place. It's hungry." A sudden sound interrupted us, a high, keening wail that wasn't quite human, followed by a series of wet, tearing noises. The sounds came from the cabin across from ours, where Elaine and Michael had been sleeping. We rushed outside, Marcus moving with unexpected speed for a man who had appeared so aged moments before. The door to the other cabin was still locked from the inside. Marcus produced a key from around his neck and unlocked it with shaking hands. The cabin was empty, both occupants gone without a trace. No sign of struggle, no blood, nothing out of place except for a perfect circle of those white many-petaled flowers on each bed. Flowers that hadn't been in bloom when we'd arrived at the camp. Flowers that shouldn't have been able to grow indoors on the hard wooden floors. Marcus backed out of the cabin, his face ashen. "It's accelerating," he whispered. "It's never taken this many this quickly before." "What is happening?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. "You owe us an explanation." But he pulled away, stumbling back toward his own cabin. "Pack your things," he ordered. "We leave at first light. The agreement is void if it breaks the pattern." That night, Marcus disappeared too. I woke just before dawn to find Thomas shaking me urgently, his eyes wide with panic. He still wouldn't speak, but he dragged me to Marcus's cabin, which was empty except for his journal, left open on his bunk. The pages were filled with those strange symbols, interspersed with English text that made little sense, references to the old ones who dwell in spaces between, mentions of a debt incurred generations ago, diagrams of the clearing showing it as some kind of nexus or portal. The final entry, dated the previous night, contained only one line: "They have chosen a new caretaker." Outside, I found Marcus's compass on the ground, the needle spinning wildly in all directions, occasionally moving in impossible ways, pointing outward from the compass face, standing perpendicular to the surface, vibrating so rapidly it blurred. Now it's just Thomas, David, and me. Except I'm not convinced it's really David anymore. He smiles too widely. His teeth have definitely changed, becoming sharper, more numerous than human teeth should be. He doesn't blink, not all now. Sometimes I catch him speaking in whispers to the treeline, his head cocked as if listening to responses I cannot hear. Thomas is changing too. This morning, I noticed a small cluster of those white flowers growing from a cut on his forearm. When I pointed it out to him, he simply plucked them, expressionless, and ate them. We should leave, I know that. Hike out the way we came in. But I'm no longer certain we can find the way, or that there even is a way anymore. Twice now, we've started down what should be the trail back to the trailhead, only to find ourselves walking back into the clearing from the opposite direction. The paths that lead from the clearing seem to circle back, no matter which direction we take. The forest has become a labyrinth, or perhaps it always was, and we were simply allowed to pass through the first time, like prey being permitted entry to a trap. Last night, I heard my name again, not from the forest this time, but whispered directly into my ear as I tried to sleep, the breath that carried it impossibly cold against my skin. I froze, too terrified to turn over, though I knew no one was physically there. Something cold brushed against my neck, like fingers made of mist. Soon, the voice said. It sounded like Rachel, and Kaylee, and Jason, and Marcus, and all the others, speaking in perfect unison with an undertone that resonated at a frequency that made my teeth ache. This morning, I woke to find a perfect circle of mushrooms had grown around my bunk overnight. White caps with red speckles, their stems iridescent in the dim light. They weren't there when I went to sleep. I'm certain of it. I would have noticed. I check every night now, inspecting every inch of my immediate surroundings. The mushrooms pulse slightly with each beat of my heart. I measured. The rhythm matches exactly. David is watching me write this. He has been standing in the corner of the cabin for hours, completely motionless except for his eyes, which follow my every movement. His smile hasn't faltered in all that time. The corners of his mouth have split slightly from the strain, but the wounds don't bleed. Instead, tiny white tendrils extend from the tears, waving gently in air that isn't moving. It's your turn, he just said, though I didn't ask him anything. Thomas hasn't returned from his morning check of the perimeter. I don't think he will. The sun is setting now. Rule 2 says I should be in my cabin by nightfall, but David is in here waiting, and something tells me that tonight, the clearing will come for me, whether I follow the rules or not. If anyone finds this journal, don't come looking for us. We're still here, in a sense. I can feel it in the soil beneath my feet, in the air that grows thicker with each breath, in the light that bends wrongly around the edges of things. But most importantly, if you're ever invited to a wilderness survival camp in these mountains, remember this. The brochure promises transformation. It doesn't mention that you won't be the one deciding what you transform into. The clearing is patient. The clearing is hungry. And the clearing always keeps what it takes.